Hello, my dear listeners. It's been a while, hasn't it? I do apologize. It wasn't intentional. I didn't mean to leave you here in the shadows for so long, but life sometimes is darkness, and sometimes we have to appease whatever lurks there in the darkness with us. However, the darkness has abated, and I have returned. However, I will be making some changes to the podcast. While I did enjoy having 2 stories for each podcast and having you decide which was the true story, I'm no longer able to continue with that style. I have a great many short stories already, and I do want to share them sooner or later, but I'm not able to share those stories every other week as I would like to. So now I will only be doing an episode once a month, and there will only be true stories. As before, these will either be personal tales, or it'll be a discussion of haunted locations in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and other nearby locations. Other paranormal investigators will be thrilled by this idea because, like me, that means somewhere new to go to and investigate. And as somebody who not only loves to visit haunted locations, but also to investigate, I am more than eager to share personal stories as they come. And if you have a location that you've visited or you've done an investigation at, and you'd love to share that story with me, please do. While I love to experience the paranormal myself, I also get a huge thrill from hearing other people's encounters. So if you would love to share your story or a location you know that's haunted, send me an email at podcastintheshadows@gmail.com. You're also welcome to join our Facebook group. The link will be below. And while I would love to be more active in the Facebook group, I'm afraid that there's just too much fun to be had in the shadows, wouldn't you say? If you're shaking your head no, then I'm afraid you're in for a dark and eerie ride. I'm so sorry, my friend, but you may as well settle in your chair and gather your blankets close, dear friend. Grab your flashlight and hold on tight because we are delving back into the shadows. For this episode, I thought we would take a fun little trip over to Jefferson, Texas, and over to the historic Kahn Hotel. As somebody who loves the paranormal, Jefferson is one of my favorite places to go, and you're about to find out why. Are you settled in? I hope so, because we're ready for our trip. Jefferson, Texas is in the deep eastern part of Texas, right alongside the edge of Louisiana, and it's a tourist's delightful niche. There are so many antique shops and quaint stores of different varieties that going for one day sometimes just isn't enough. Luckily, there are so many bed and breakfasts here and 3 historic hotels to be found. Visitors to the city will find there are so many events happening through the year, they'll want to come back for more. However, there are other aspects about Jefferson that make it worth the trip for certain individuals. That's because Jefferson is very well known for being one of the most haunted cities in Texas. The city was named after the 3rd U.S. president, and it's unique not only for the oddity of its streets, but also for its violent history. It was once a logging town with an important port in the mid-1800s. It had waters that rose high enough to allow commercial riverboats to travel the Red Rivers and Caddo Lake with ease. Loggers could walk from one side of the port to the other, using the massive logs that clogged the waters without much concern. Barely anybody fell in the waters. Accidents happened, of course, as accidents will, but that hardly brushes at the amount of lives lost in Jefferson. That's because the type of work people could find here was often rough, and it often brought the harshest sort of people in, the type who carried weapons and homemade alcohol and a cutthroat attitude. With these people came seedy bars, brothels, and cheap motels, all of which endured countless bloodshed. In fact, it's possible that the historic Kahn Hotel is considered one of the most haunted hotels in Jefferson because of all the bloodshed that happened there. When it first opened up, it was known as the Kahn Saloon back in 1865, and above the saloon was a prominent and well-used brothel. At the turn of the century, it was changed into a funeral home, which many speculate gave rise to the amount of otherworldly residents which reside in this building. The current owners of the building renovated it and opened it as a hotel in 2016. Not only are they aware of the colorful history of the building, they love to share stories of the ghostly residents that still roam around. Should you choose to stay at the hotel, there's a chance of meeting Madame Jessica, who not only worked in the brothel but lived there with her 7-year-old son, Andrew. Jessica happened to encounter a pair of thieves who had broken into the brothel late one evening just as she was stepping out of a bath. The would-be thieves grabbed Jessica and her son and yanked them back into the bathroom to drown them before she could alert anybody of their presence. Now Jessica is seen along the stairs, usually wearing white. Some people have said they felt her presence in the area or have felt a warm touch on their arm. Andrew, on the other hand, is often mischievous and he loves to play pranks. People will complain about rattling doorknobs or feeling somebody tug at their hair or clothes. Objects will be moved around, and there are times that they've said they could have sworn they heard children laughing when there were no children in the building. Jessica wouldn't be the only prostitute you might encounter, however. In 2016, somebody who was on the Jefferson Ghost Walk tour took a picture of the back door. They didn't see it at the time, but later when looking at the picture, there seemed to be a large blood stain that appeared. At the time of the tour, nobody saw the stain. Many believe the blood stain could be attributed to a young prostitute who, back in the mid-1800s, was accosted in that alleyway by that door. The young woman was brutally beaten and left for dead, and she had enough strength to drag herself to the door, where she died shortly after. Not much is known about the young woman, but there is a chance this is Abigail, one of the spirits who will enter rooms at random and sit at the edge of the bed to wake people up. There's also the chance of encountering Jacqueline. Beautiful Jacqueline moved to Jefferson from New Orleans back in the 1860s and had two particular men who were deeply infatuated with her. In fact, they were so infatuated with the lovely Jacqueline that they grew to hate each other. In a fit of jealous anger, they chose to duel right outside the saloon, and with one shot between the two, killed each other. As a response, the two men were buried in a common grave together at the Oak Grove Cemetery. 2 stones were set up with their names on them and 2 metal posts alongside that with a chain between them, forever linking them in the afterlife against their will. Perhaps that's why they're so restless and still fight even to this day. Visitors to the hotel have not only heard 2 men arguing with each other, they've also recorded what sounds like 2 gunshots going off and a young woman screaming for help. As for Jacqueline, she was so distraught over the 2 men having that duel and dying over her that she hung herself the next night in her room. People have heard a young woman crying and often moaning upstairs. They believe that Jacqueline still grieves over the 2 men. Of course, there is a chance those tears belong to the young would-be bride who was killed by her father by accident. As the story goes, young Billy and his lady love escaped one evening with the intent of eloping. However, her father found out about the plans and went chasing after them. He caught up to them there at the saloon, and he and Billy began a furious argument. It didn't take long for the altercation to turn into a fight. Once the argument turned physical, everything went wrong immediately. The young bride was knocked through a 3rd-story window to her death in the streets below. Young Billy was knocked out by the father, and in his grieving rage, the father took Billy and hung him from the rafters from a noose. Billy still resides there as a poltergeist, friendly, but warning people that he does not want them in his space. He's apparently more lenient towards women, but he will still move things around and make sounds to make sure people know he's there and he does not like to be bothered. Not all the spirits who are found at the historic Kahn Hotel died there, however. In the past few years, people who have taken pictures of one of the windows upstairs finds a young woman smiling back down at them. Not only is she often smiling in the pictures, but she also seems to be naked, and they believe that this is a young woman that visited the hotel with the idea of moving there to Jefferson. On her way back from California, she was sadly killed in an accident, and she began to appear shortly after that. While she has shown up in a few pictures, the young lady otherwise doesn't make herself known inside the hotel. But there are other spirits who do make themselves known by being heard but not seen. People will hear tapping on the windows, and this is apparently the watchman, whose name is unknown. He goes around to the windows and taps the butt of his shotgun against each window, an indication that the place is safe and that he's keeping watch. It's not only the downstairs area that he watches either. He's also been heard on the second floor tapping at those windows as well. And since those windows are more than 20 feet from the ground, it would clearly be impossible for a human to go around tapping at those windows. While not everybody who has stayed at the Kahn Hotel has left with an experience, there have been too many stories not to believe that the building is haunted. Should you ever be in the area and you would care to stay there, you can go to their website, kahnsaloon.com, and I'll have the link below for you to go visit. You could also visit the cafe downstairs for a coffee and a story, or even join the historic Jefferson Ghost Walk with Jody Breckenridge. I've been on that tour quite a few times, and let me tell you, Jody is not only a wonderful storyteller, but she always has new tales to tell, and she knows a great amount of history about the city which she is eager to impart. I've also included the link to the Jefferson Ghost Walk below, and I do hope if you're ever in the area that you will take her up on one of those tours. As for my own experiences, I was there on the ghost tour about 15 or 16 years ago and was with a group of friends whenever we went on the tour together. The hotel had not been opened, of course. It was still being remodeled, and we'd gone into the coffee shop to hear a few of the stories before being taken up. Only a certain amount of people were being taken at a time, and when our group finally got to go up, one of the members of the group complained they felt somebody pulling at their hair. They began to shiver shortly after that because it felt like somebody had brushed their hand along their arm. Another person in the group had gone to a far corner and said it felt like a cold draft was following them. We ventured over to them to put our hands in the area they were talking about, and all of us could feel the chill. As that person moved around, it felt like the chill was moving after them. The sensation lasted for about a minute, maybe two, and finally dissipated, only to come back about 5 minutes later and attach to somebody else. And finally, as the tour was leaving the building, a few of us heard a small child call out goodbye. However, there were no children on the tour that evening, and there were definitely no children in the building at the time. At that time, we hadn't heard the story of Jessica or Andrew. We'd never heard of it, so we had no clear indication as to why we heard a child calling out to us. However, one of the members of the group had taken a picture of one of the upper windows. There was the face of a little boy gazing down at us. Sadly, the member of the group who had that picture has passed on, and her son isn't sure what she'd done with the pictures from that trip. On another occasion that I went on the ghost tour with a couple of friends, we happened again to go into the coffee shop. It was a bitterly cold night from what I remember, and I was shivering. When we went into the building, I was grateful to get something warm and happened to glance up at the stairs because I felt like somebody was watching us. It seemed I wasn't the only one with that sensation, however, because somebody else on the tour mentioned that they felt like somebody was standing at the top of the stairs and was waiting for us to come up. We were told the story of the woman in white, and while we didn't know Jessica's name at the time, eventually we would learn that she was the Madam in White who often stands at the top of the stairs. That same night, another member of the tour mentioned seeing a little boy standing at the top of the stairs as well, but he didn't mention anything until after the tour was nearly over. I'm sad to say there were no corroborating pictures, and I didn't get anything with an indication of a spirit being in that room at the time. As much as I would have loved to have proof, all I could go on was the sensation of being watched. Shortly after the Kahn Hotel opened its doors, a friend of mine and her husband decided to stay there for their anniversary. They had a few interesting and terrifying encounters. Shortly after she and her husband got to their room, he went downstairs to grab a couple of things from the vehicle, and she heard the doorknob rattling. Thinking that perhaps his hands were too full or somehow he'd got stuck outside the door, she tried to turn the knob only to find that it wouldn't budge. She tried for a couple of seconds, told her husband, whom she thought was on the other side, to stop playing around, and tried the doorknob again to find that it twisted with ease. Of course, her husband wasn't there at the door. In confusion, she sat down on the bed and waited for him to come upstairs, only to ask him, "Did you just try to play a prank on me?" Of course, he told her no and said he'd only just come back upstairs. Later that night, she was jerked out of a deep sleep when her husband began to yell at the top of his lungs. He swore that somebody else was in the room and that he'd felt them hover over him. He even said he felt their breath on his face. She thought at first he'd been influenced by the idea of them being in a haunted hotel and thought he'd had a bad dream. He told her not only had his eyes been open, but he'd glanced over at the window and thought he'd seen a shadow move gently in their direction. Thinking that it was his wife, he called out to her, and as soon as he did, the sheet suddenly tightened against him. He said it felt like somebody had bunched up the sheets on each side of him and then pressed down as hard as they could. That's when he began to yell and woke his wife up. The last interaction happened early in the morning, between 4 to 5 o'clock. She swore she heard a tap from somewhere in the room, but she couldn't attest to where it had come from at the time. Looking back, she now wonders if perhaps she'd heard the watchman. Her husband complained that perhaps the Kahn Hotel was a bit too haunted for them to stay in again and suggested they might stay at the Jefferson Hotel instead next time, until I told him that it also had a haunted history and I'd had my own encounters in that building as well. As I said, Jefferson is very haunted and it celebrates that it has a lot of paranormal activity. In fact, there's a very well-known story of a fire that had happened at a hotel and a little girl banging at every door to wake everybody up so that they could get out safely. However, whenever they got downstairs to try and find the little blonde girl and thank her, nobody could find her. And yet, that little girl has been seen in multiple areas downtown since then. There are so many other stories that I could share about Jefferson alone, or even about Excelsior Hotel or the Jefferson Hotel, but I would rather leave that for another time. After all, my dear friend, we've been sitting here in the darkness for a rather long time, and I'm afraid the hour has grown late, and there's no telling what ghouls and ghosts may be creeping toward us at this very moment. But don't worry, my dear friend, I will have more stories for you. As I said, Jefferson has a lot of stories to it, and I'm excited to share as many as I possibly can. Are you still in need of a good scare? Then I invite you to go visit my friend's podcast, Beyond the Campfire Light. The author, Landon, is an incredible storyteller, and he's had people assisting him with the voice acting. I urge you to visit and take a listen to his stories. But as I've said, my dear friend, the hour has grown late, and it's time for me to bid you a fond good night. I do hope you sleep tight, and don't let the ghouls bite.